Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be talking about Jinja and the essentials of Jinja. Let's go ahead and get started. And as always, thank you for watching. So as we progress through the video, we're going to be talking about what is Jinja, some of the basic syntax, what we can do with Jinja using the Jinja Live editor, and a very important concept called list comprehension. So what is Jinja? Jinja is a templating language or a programming language that we usually use to create or modify some sort of data. That data can come in a number of different formats, and the format that we generally see it as is JSON. As with many programming languages, a lot of the features and functionality that we would expect are also here in Jinja. Things like loops, conditional statements, and creating and modifying variables. Here in the Rewst world, we are using Jinja to do just that. Modify and process information. When we're using Jinja, a lot of what we've seen already with Jinja is with braces, and specifically curly braces. So now we can finally put together what are those two curly braces. So when we're using two curly braces, this is letting us know that we are outputting a specific value. So in our example of Rewst 102, we are outputting the value of things like the user ID, the group ID, and the action variable. A curly brace with a % is denoting a block of code that we want to run. Generally, we're using this syntax when doing things like if-else statements or for loops. And finally, the last syntax I want to highlight is the curly brace with the # or the hashtag. This is denoting comments. Let's talk a little bit about JSON files. A JSON file is used to represent data, and it's done in a way where we can easily read it. Let's take a look and see an example really quick. The way JSON files work is through what we call key value pairs. So on the left-hand side are our keys, and then the right-hand side is the value that's assigned to a key. So very similar to variables and assigning values to variables. So some of the examples that we have here are things like a name, which is the key, and then the value, which is hen solo. We have age, and the value is 4, and so on and so forth. You'll see that in a JSON file, there are a number of different format types that it supports. Things like strings, integers, and lists. As we discussed in Rewst 102, we have variables that live in this place called the context, and we refer to those as context variables. Those variables are created within the Jinja world, and we can also create variables in a section of our workflows called data aliases. So whether we're calling them variables, context variables, or data aliases, these are three different terms referring to the same thing. In this slide here, we're just highlighting that we can create data aliases and assign values to them. And this is all done behind the scenes using Jinja. So let's highlight some of the things we can do in Jinja. As with most programming languages, we can have if-else statements. So we can check a specific condition to see if it is or isn't true. So in this first example, we're checking to see if the user is logged in. If the user is logged in, then we will perform something. In this case, we are outputting the sentence, welcome, followed by the output of the username variable. So we see the two curly brackets here. This is letting us know that we are outputting the value of the variable username. We hit the next line on line number 3. Otherwise, or if the condition is not true on line 1, then we're going to execute whatever's after the else. In this case, we're going to be outputting the statement, please log in to continue. And then in Jinja syntax, we're going to need to end the if-else statement on line 5. On the right-hand side here, here's another example of using an if-else statement using a feature called ElseIf. So we can check multiple conditions using this type of feature. So we're going to check if x is equal to 1. We're going to print out that sentence on line 2. Else, if x is equal to 2, we'll print out the sentence on line 4. And then the final else is catching every other thing. So if not the first, so if x is not equal to 1, and if x is not equal to 2, everything else we're going to be printing line 6. So highlighting some of the things we can do in the Jinja world, specifically if-else statements. Let's talk about filters. Filters are pre-configured algorithms or functionality that we can use without having to implement any sort of logic or code. So commonly used filters such as capitalize, upper, and lower allow us to perform these commonly used tasks without having to implement anything on our end. All we need to do is use the filter. And the way we use the filter is taking the output of something and passing it or sending it to the filter. And the way that we do that is with a character called the pipe character. So some of the examples down here at the bottom, we have a specific text variable. We are outputting the value of the text variable with those 2 curly brackets into the filter called truncate. Truncate is going to shorten or truncate the length of the text to 20 characters. The other example here is we're going to take the output of a username or send it to the filter called capitalize using the pipe character, and it will capitalize the first letter of the string. And the last example shows that we can send the output of a variable through multiple filters. So the user's email will be sent through the lower filter, which will lowercase the email, and then it will replace the @ sign with the word @ in the lowercase email. So filters are beneficial because it allows us to implement these commonly used tasks without having to program it ourselves. We've also implemented some filters in the Rewst world, and here are a list of a couple of those. And finally, we have this thing called list comprehension. List comprehension is a special syntax that's used to create lists. When we are in our demo environment, I'll speak more about list comprehension. But for now, just remember that list comprehension is a special syntax that's used to create a list based off of other lists and conditions that we set. Next up, we're looking at for loops. Generally speaking, when we're using for loops in Jinja, it's a way for us to go through each item of a list. So the way that it works is we designate what I like to call a pointer. And what the pointer will do is exactly what the name says. It will point at each item of a list. So starting with our line 1 at the very top, we have a pointer named thing. And this pointer will point at each item of our list of things. And as it points at each item, it will output the value of the thing that the pointer is pointing at. So if we have a list of 3 items, the thing pointer will point at each of the 3 items. And for each time that it does, it will output the value of the thing. The next example down here is showing how we can add conditions to our for loop. So same parts from the beginning, we have a pointer called thing that will point at each item of our list. We're then going to do a check and say if the thing that the pointer is pointing at does not equal bad stuff, then we will output the value of the thing that the pointer is pointing at. Then it will output the value of the thing. As a note, the editor that we're using throughout Rewst is known as the Monaco editor, and it is the same editor that's used in VSCode. So if you're familiar with many of the shortcuts in VSCode, you can also use it within the editor in Rewst. We're going to dive into our example shortly, but to give a preview of what it is, we're going to have some data presented to us in JSON, and this data will have a menu. We'll have a menu of what's for lunch. We'll go through that menu and execute some Jinja statements to answer some of the questions here. In the description of this video, as well as on the page that this video is on, we'll be using this URL. So go ahead and click on the URL, and I'll meet you over in our instance of Rewst. After clicking the link, it brings us over to our Jinja Live editor. We see there are some pre-populated comments within the editor itself. And then if we expand out the context, there's also some data in here. I'll collapse some of the things within our context so we can easily see what's inside. So the first thing I'll highlight is there are two variables within our context. We have days, and then we have week. Here, the week is a simple string, and then days is a list. We know it's a list based off of the square brace there. Expanding out days will reveal all of the days, and then within each day, it'll have things like the lunch, the drinks, the entrees, etc. And then you can take a little bit of time to look through. Each day has a number of attributes to it. So within our days variable, we have a number of items. So I'll be referring to each day within our days list as an item. So each of our item has a number of attributes that we can access. Now let's head down to our Jinja Live Editor and uncomment some of these commands and see what they do. As a heads up, I'm going to be using the keyboard shortcut Control-Enter or Command-Return if you are on a Mac. That will render or execute our Jinja code. You can also click on the render button down at the bottom right. I'll also be uncommenting using Control followed by /. So let's go ahead and start with our first line here. So 2 curly brackets lets us know we're outputting the value of something, and the thing that we're outputting will be the entire context. So rendering this command like so will show us the entire context. Context comes to us as result, and then the result of the context is what we see within the context up here in the dropdown. Within the context, we can access a couple of different things, such as the week variable. And we'll see that it renders the value of the week variable that lines up exactly with what we see within the context. What we can do next is send our variables through a filter. So taking the days variable, we can then send the output of days through a filter called length. This will give us the number of items within our list. That represents the number of days within our days variable. So taking the output of ctx.days and sending it or piping it to our filter called length. So that takes care of a couple of things here, highlighting that the double curlies outputs the value of a variable. We can access the context using ctx, and then access the variables using dot followed by the variable name. Let's see some other things that we can do with Jinja. I'll start here at line 17 and uncomment down to line 19. Starting on line 17, we see a for loop, and as we discussed in the slides, a for loop allows us to go through each item of a list. The way that we do that is by giving a name to what I like to call a pointer, and the pointer will point at each item of the list. As we do, there are a number of things that you can do with that. In this example here on line 18, our pointer is called weekday, and as it points at an item, we can access the attributes of the item. So in this situation, we're accessing the attribute of day, followed by lunch and dessert over in this Jinja statement here. So if I go back into the context, you'll see that within our item, we have the day attribute. This example is Friday. And then the lunch attribute also has some attributes of its own. So lunch has the attribute of dessert right here. So the pointer points at an item and allows us to access the attributes and sub-attributes of the item that it's pointing at. So let's go ahead and run this code and see what happens. So you will see it points at each item within our list called days. As it does, we will be accessing the day attribute and then the lunch and dessert attribute and printing those out as sentences that we see here on line 18 and the result over here on the right hand side. So for loops allows us to go through each item of a list, and as we do, we can access the attributes that the pointer is pointing at to do something. The next thing we're going to be highlighting is list comprehension. So as a recap, list comprehension is a special syntax that we use to create lists based off of other lists and conditions. If you're familiar with list comprehension in the Python world, this is the same thing here in the Jinja Rewst world. But if not, that's okay. Let's go ahead and talk through what list comprehension is and how the syntax works. So the syntax in list comprehension will have at least 2 lines, but sometimes it'll have 3 lines. So I'll start off here and I will start a new list comprehension just for example to highlight what those 3 lines are. So the first line I like to call the output. So when we're creating a new list, what is the new list of items that is going to be the output? The second line I like to call construction. This is how are we building our new list? Or in other words, which existing lists are we using to build our new list? So I like to call this construction. And then the last line I like to call condition. Condition is the conditions that we use to pick and choose the different items of the list that we are building our new list off of. So conditions. If this, add it to our new list. If not this, exclude it from our list. Those type of conditions. So generally, list comprehension follows this type of syntax. We'll output a new list. We're going to build that new list based off an existing list. And then we're going to use filters or conditions to pick and choose the items of an existing list to add to our new list. So let's go ahead and see this in action. So I'll start by uncommenting line 22 to line 27 using my keyboard shortcut Control / or Command /. And the first line here is the output. The second line here is our construction. I generally like to start with the second line, makes it easier to explain. So the second line is what are we building our new list from, the construction part. So we have a pointer called weekday, and it's going to be pointing at each item of the list CTX days. Since we don't have a third line, there are no conditions to filter which items we're picking and choosing. In this situation, we're going to be picking all of the items in the ctx.days list. The output of the new list will be what we see here, this sentence. The dessert on the day attribute of what the pointer is pointing at, followed by the lunch dessert attribute of the item that the pointer is pointing at. To give us the sentence, the dessert on a specific day is the dessert. So if we run this, this will look very similar to what we saw in the previous example, but using list comprehension. I'll go ahead and comment this away, and then we'll see another example of list comprehension. So uncommenting line 34 to 39. Same idea on the second part of our list comprehension. We're building our new list off of the list ctx.days. And as we point at each item, the output of our new list is going to be the lunch and then the sides attribute. So we can see as it points at each item, it will access the lunch followed by the sides attribute. And let's see what this looks like. You'll then see it's giving us a result of the sides for each day. And you'll notice that the sides is represented as a list, as you can see in my example here on line 98. So one thing we can do is reduce our list of lists. So we can take all of the results of our lists and put them together as one list. And we can use a filter to do that. So at the end of my list comprehension, I can take the output of my new list and pass it to a filter called flatten. When I run this, what it will do is take all of the items out of the lists and consolidate it or flatten it into one list. We can then show some other examples here of taking the results of one filter and sending it to another. So maybe I want to sort the list in alphabetical order. And we have the list in alphabetical order. And then you'll notice that there's sweet potato fries twice. So maybe I only want a list of the unique sides. So I don't need to see sweet potato fries twice. I just need to know that it is a side. So I can pass the results to yet another filter, and we can use a filter called unique, and it'll show me the unique values within my list. So some examples here of using filters. And again, if you're curious as to what filters are available to you, there'll be a link to the documentation in the description or on the page that this video is on. Let's go ahead and comment these. And let's see an example of using list comprehension with a condition. So we'll go down here to line 63 and we will uncomment this. And this is where we'll see the 3-line structure I was talking about earlier. So output, construction, condition. So starting on the second line, this is following the same part as we've seen before, building a new list based off of our list ctx.days. We now have a condition. What we'll be checking to see is as the weekday pointer points at each item of the list, we'll see if the lunch drink attribute is equal to the string or the value milk. So we'll go through each item, we'll look at the drink and see, is it equal to milk? If it is equal to milk, we will add it to the list. If it is not equal to milk, then we will exclude the item from the list. And in this case, each item that we're adding to the list, we will be outputting the day attribute. Let's see what this looks like. So it will go through each item, and if it fulfills our condition, that item will be added to our list. And the way that we have our output set up, we'll be outputting the day attribute. And in this situation, we see that Monday is the only day that shows up. But here in my example, you'll see that one of the drinks here is chocolate milk. It's technically milk. But one of the issues that we have is that we are looking for the literal value milk. Is the drink attribute equal to milk? So to accommodate chocolate milk, what we can do is change the way we're setting up our condition. So rather than looking for a literal value milk, we can just look for the word milk if milk is anywhere within the drink attribute. And we can switch that up like this. So we can search for milk like this as a capital, and if it is in the weekday.lunch.drink attribute. And if I search like this, we'll have Monday and Friday show up. But maybe the person who's setting up this menu might not capitalize milk. We're again looking for a literal value of milk as uppercase. And maybe it might come out as lowercase, maybe someone might use uppercase. So to try to account for some of these situations, we can use a filter to help us out with this. So we can pass it to the filter called lower. And instead of looking for a capital milk, we can look for a lowercase milk. So the pointer will be pointing at lunch, followed by drink, and then it will lowercase the value of the drink. So chocolate milk will be lowercase c, lowercase m, and then we're going to be looking for that lowercase m milk to again account for any sort of oddities. And we'll see that the result is the same. So very good. And the last thing we're going to be looking at is creating or setting variables in Jinja itself. So starting on line 81, we are setting a variable called Milky Days. And the value of Milky Days is going to be a list. And based off of our syntax, we're using list comprehension to create our new list. Starting on the second line, this is the same thing we've seen again and again, creating a new list based off of our list called CTX days with our pointer called weekday. And here in the condition, as our pointer points at the lunch.drink attribute, we're going to pass that over to our lower filter to lowercase the value of that attribute. We're then going to check to see if the word milk is in that lowercase value. The same thing we did previously. And then from here, our output is just going to be our pointer weekday. On line 87, we're going to have a for loop that will go through each item of the list that we just created, Milky Days. Using the same pointer name weekday, we will have a sentence here that lets us know which day we need to bring a different drink because they're going to be serving some sort of milky drink. So let's go ahead and run this and see how it works. So our Milky Days is going to contain two objects. It's going to contain our object for Monday and then our object for Friday. We have these two objects and we're able to access his attributes using the weekday pointer in our line 87 for loop. We're going to access the day attribute as well as the lunch.time attribute and then the lunch.drink attribute. And by doing so, we're able to create more meaningful messages, letting us know we should bring our own drink to lunch at this time on this day because they're serving milk. That wraps it up for our exercise here in Rewst 103. I want to thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.